The fluorescent lights of Cedar Creek Medical cast harsh shadows across the ICU floor as Brooke Sullivan pushed through the double doors at 0630 hours, her scrubs still damp from the pre-dawn rain outside. Antiseptic smell mixed with the metallic tang of monitored air, that particular hospital scent that never quite washed out of your hair no matter how many times you showered. She kept her head down, badge clipped to her pocket, clipboard already in hand before she reached the nurse's station. Nobody looked up. That was the point. 23 years old, according to her credentials. Pediatric nursing background, 3 years at Seattle General, spotless record, no complications, no questions. The Pentagon's cover was flawless because it had to be. Captain Brooke Sullivan didn't exist here. Only Brooke existed. Quiet. Competent. Invisible. The morning shift briefing was already underway, charge nurse Garcia running through patient assignments with the rhythm of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Brooke accepted her unit without comment, 4 beds, 2 post-op recoveries, 1 palliative care case, and room for 47. She didn't react to room for 47. Her hand stayed steady on the clipboard, her eyes blank as Arizona sky. "Sullivan, you've got the medic again today," Garcia said, barely glancing up. "Sergeant Cross. Still non-responsive to pain, still maxed on morphine. Families in and out, so keep the room tidy and the lines patent. Straightforward, sit and monitor." Brooke nodded once. Understood. She'd already been watching room for 47 for 73 days. The medical part was easy. It was the rest that required discipline. The unit sprawled across the 3rd floor like a maze of suffering and recovery, machines beeping their metallic rhythm, fours dripping carefully measured salvation, the whispered prayers of families who'd already learned that hope was a luxury. Brooke moved through the corridors with economy of motion, the kind of movement that comes from training, from understanding that wasted energy was wasted oxygen. Her hands moved on their own, checking lines, adjusting monitors, noting vitals in the electronic charts. Her expression never changed. A young man in the bed by the window watched her pass and something flickered in his eyes, recognition maybe, or just the desperation of the dying reaching for any human connection. She noted his oxygen saturation, 91%, acceptable, and moved on. Room for 47 was at the far end of the unit, where the afternoon light came in golden and cruel through windows that overlooked Pikes Peak in the distance. Brooke pushed the door open slowly, not wanting to startle him, though startle implied consciousness, and Sergeant Dylan Cross had checked out of that particular experience 3 weeks ago. He lay against the pillows like something that had already given up, his frame consumed by the lymphoma that had metastasized through his body like an invading army. Stage 4. 26 years old. The chart said he'd been Special Forces medic, 160th SOAR attachment, 3 deployments, 2 Purple Hearts, and 1 catastrophic diagnosis that chewed through prognosis like ammunition. His skin had the waxy translucence of the dying, and his breathing came shallow and mechanical through the oxygen cannula. But his forearm. God, his forearm. Sullivan ran in block letters down the inside of his left arm, the letters thick and black, done in a field medical station probably, done in that specific way that combat troops did tattoos, permanent marks for permanent moments. Brooke had carried him 2 miles through Tikrit on her back with a sucking chest wound that hissed like a punctured tire, his blood mixing with her sweat, his weight dragging them both toward a medevac point that might not be there, might be overrun, might be a ghost. She'd kept him conscious by talking, kept him breathing by handbagging him when the shrapnel got too close, kept him alive through fire that came from 3 directions and nowhere all at once. He'd asked for her name just before the dust-off, delirious, barely holding onto the edge of existence. She'd told him. Sullivan. She'd said it twice to make sure it stuck. He'd gotten it tattooed for months later during recovery rotation in Germany. She'd found out from a casualty report email she shouldn't have been reading and never spoke about it again. That tattoo was classified in ways the Pentagon didn't have clearance for. Brooke adjusted the 4-line with a gentleness that contradicted the precision of her movements, checking the flow rate, confirming the line hadn't kinked, ensuring the morphine drip remained steady at 3 milligrams per hour. His eyes tracked her, or tried to. Morphine pulled his pupils down to pinpoints, erased the world beyond the immediate moment. She was just a shape to him, just another nurse in scrubs, just another person trying to manage his exit from a body that had already left the building. "Oxygen's good," she said quietly, speaking the words for the chart, for anyone listening, not for him. "Lines are patent. Pain management adequate." His hand moved then, a sudden twitch that might have been intention or might have been nerve misfires, the body's last conversations with itself. She let him reach, didn't pull away, let his fingers find the fabric of her scrub top. He was looking at her now, really looking, trying to find someone in the fog. She waited, patient as stone. "Water," he whispered, the word breaking apart like dry earth. She poured him a cup with a plastic straw, held it where he could drink without choking. He managed 3 sips before the effort became too much and his head fell back. Within seconds, the morphine reclaimed him. His eyes closed. His breathing went back to the mechanical shallow rhythm it had been maintaining for weeks. She set the cup on the nightstand and checked the monitor one more time. Sinus rhythm. Steady. Not going anywhere for at least another 12 hours, maybe more. The lymphoma was taking its time, which was sometimes worse than the quick violence of trauma. Trauma, she understood. Trauma was clean. This was arithmetic, time minus function divided by morphine, adding up to something that looked like peace but felt like surrender. The window behind his bed showed the mountains clear and bright, that Colorado Springs clarity that made everything look closer than it actually was. Brooke stood there for exactly 30 seconds, let her hand rest on the bed rail, then turned and walked out of the room before anyone could see her face. The car was a gray 2019 Honda Accord registered to Brooke Sullivan with a Colorado Springs address that was real but unoccupied, a safe house maintained by the Pentagon that she'd never actually slept in. The glove compartment held exactly 3 items: the registration, the insurance card, and a small wooden box the size of a greeting card. She unlocked the compartment during her lunch break, sitting in the parking lot with the engine off, rain starting to patter against the windshield like Morse code. The flag was a military burial flag, 13 folds, red, white, and blue, the kind given to families of service members who died in service to their country. Staff Sergeant Maria Okonkwo had been Brooke's squad medic, the woman who'd taught her advanced field surgery in a Humvee moving through hostile territory, who'd laughed like wind chimes in the breaks between firefights, who'd saved 6 lives in Tikrit in a single afternoon before an IED took her off the board permanently. The flag came back in a box. Maria came back in pieces. Brooke touched the folds once, just once, let her fingertips rest on the fabric for 3 seconds, then locked the compartment again and sat in the grey afternoon until her hands stopped shaking. When she got back to the hospital, nobody had missed her. Nobody ever did. The afternoon briefing came at 1,400 hours, the shift change where morning staff handed off to evening staff in the same neutral tones used for weather reports. Dr. Pierce arrived on the unit at 14:17 exactly, his $800 Italian shoes clicking against the tile floor with the rhythm of someone who owned the space. His tablet was already pulling up patient information, his eyes already scanning the floor for inefficiencies, for protocol violations, for any nurse who might be vulnerable to correction. He moved past the supply station where Brooke was restocking catheter trays, didn't acknowledge her presence, didn't need to. She was background. She was a junior nurse doing her job quietly, the kind of nurse that competent administrators could ignore until something went wrong and then blame entirely. She felt his attention the way prey feels predators, a shift in pressure, a change in the electromagnetic field that meant danger was aware of the room. He walked to room for 47, pushed through the door, and stood there for exactly 40 seconds, reading the monitors, reading the chart, reading the body in the bed like it was a coding problem he could solve if he just understood the variables. Then he turned and walked back to his office, his shoes clicking in rhythm with the ventilator down the hall, 2 separate heartbeats in the same space. Brooke finished restocking the trays. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed even. Her expression remained blank as a hospital wall. She was invisible again, which meant she was exactly where she needed to be. She was exactly who she needed to be. And in room for 47, Sergeant Dylan Cross slept the morphine sleep of the dying, her name tattooed on his forearm in permanent ink, a secret written in his own skin that only he knew the cost of. The folder in her car, locked in the trunk behind the spare tire, contained 17 months of documentation. Inflated equipment charges on 42 separate cases. Phantom procedures coded on terminal patients who couldn't have possibly survived the treatments listed. Insurance fraud with a delta of $847,000 and climbing. Dr. Pierce was careful, which made him dangerous. Careful people don't leave obvious trails. Careful people build infrastructures of small compromises and document everything in a language of billing codes that looked legitimate unless you knew exactly how to read it. She knew how to read it. She'd been trained to read it. That was the job. That was the entire reason the Pentagon had placed her here, had buried Captain Brooke Sullivan under the cover of a quiet pediatric nurse who kept her head down and never asked questions and filed every detail in the kind of memory palace that combat training builds. The rain picked up as evening settled over Cedar Creek Medical, hammering the ER entrance like applause that nobody had earned. Brooke Sullivan walked out with her shift complete, her documentation filed, her report uploaded to a secure Pentagon server using a burner phone in the hospital bathroom. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked questions. Nobody looked twice at the quiet nurse heading home with nothing but her scrubs and her secrets. The room 447 door closed softly behind Dr. Pierce at 1,400 hours, but Brooke Sullivan knew he wasn't leaving. She felt his presence before she heard his voice, that particular weight of authority mixed with contempt, the kind that fills spaces like smoke. The Martinez family sat vigil 3 feet away, a Wheeler in the adjacent bed, tubes running like vines through her papery skin. Brooke had just finished adjusting the fall line on Sergeant Dylan Cross when Pierce's voice cut across the beeping monitors with surgical precision. "This is the 3rd medication delay I've documented this week, Sullivan." His words projected loud enough for the Martinez daughter to hear, loud enough for the visiting family member reading a magazine in the corner to look up. Perhaps pediatric nursing was beyond your capabilities after all. She didn't flinch. Her jaw tightened for one invisible second, the kind of tension only someone trained in restraint would recognize, but her hands remained steady as she continued her foot check on Cross, her fingers moving with the careful attention of someone who'd threaded catheters through worse than hospital politics. Cross lay motionless, morphine-clouded eyes seeing only a stranger in scrubs, not the woman who'd carried him 2 miles through Tikrit with a sucking chest wound and his blood soaking through her uniform. Pierce stepped closer, invading her workspace with deliberate aggression. His cologne, something expensive, something that smelled like money and entitlement, invaded the space where antiseptic and saline solution should live. Or perhaps you're simply not cut out for critical care. He glanced at the Martinez family, reading their reactions like a performance review. Some people lack the intellectual rigor required. The Martinez daughter's eyes widened in second-hand embarrassment. Her hand found her mother's shoulder, a gesture of protection that Brooke had seen 1,000 times in 1,000 rooms, the family's silent apology for the cruelty happening in front of them. Brooke raised her gaze to meet Pierce's for exactly 2 seconds, held it without expression, then returned to her charting. The silence between them had weight. Had gravity. Had the terrible patience of someone who'd survived worse than words. Pierce smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed his position made him untouchable. "I'll take your silence as acknowledgement." He left a performance review form on the bedside table, marked urgent in red pen that looked like blood on the white paper. His footsteps echoed down the corridor with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged successfully. Brooke didn't watch him go. She checked Cross's vitals one more time, oxygen saturation steady at 89%, heart rate elevated but stable, pain management holding, and moved to the next patient without a word. The break room at 1,520 hours smelled like microwaved leftovers and the particular staleness of air recirculated through hospital vents 1,000 times too many. Brooke unwrapped her lunch, turkey sandwich, apple, bottle of water she'd brought from home because the hospital vending machine prices gouged nurses like parasites, and sat by the window. Colorado Springs stretched out below like a map of a life she wasn't supposed to be living. The Cheyenne mountain peaks held snow at their peaks even in late spring, permanent and unchanging, the way mountains should be. For nurses entered at 15:25. Jen, Marcus, Alicia, Tom, the break room crew who usually filled the silence with hospital gossip and complaint. She recognized their footsteps before she saw them. Their energy shifted when they realized she was there. Jen's hand froze on the refrigerator handle. Marcus exchanged a glance with Tom that contained an entire conversation. The chairs scraped against linoleum as they collected their containers, their lunches, their belongings, and left without a word. The silence they left behind was louder than their presence had been. Brooke sat alone by the window and ate her sandwich methodically, without tasting it. Food was fuel. Food was information. The body required calories to function at operational capacity. Her mind worked through the differential, 3 medication delays documented, all of them legitimate patient safety decisions made while Pierce was in meetings or gone from the unit, delays that appeared on his chart even though he hadn't been present to witness them. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The tremor that wanted to live in her chest stayed locked away where it belonged, in the compartment marked emotional response to institutional betrayal, which was a luxury she couldn't afford. At 1800 hours, end of shift, she passed the unit board on her way to clock out. The third written warning was posted in bold-faced type, Dr. Pierce's handwriting as precise and cold as a surgical incision, insubordination. Failed to follow direct orders regarding patient visitation protocols. Disciplinary action pending. 3 residents read it as she walked past. She heard their whispers, Sullivan again, and Pierce is really coming down on her, and third one this month. But the words passed through her like wind through a chain-link fence. They were words. They were noise. They were tactical moves from an opponent who didn't understand the game being played. She clocked out at 18:03. The timestamp on the computer screen felt significant somehow, 18 months in country, 18 months of wearing this nurse uniform over her real uniform, 18 months of collecting evidence in notebooks hidden under the floorboard of her apartment, and now the timeline was accelerating. The fraud pattern was visible if you knew how to read it. Inflated equipment charges on terminal patients who wouldn't survive to appeal them. Phantom procedures coded on the dying, billed to insurance companies who paid without question because who would defraud Medicare on someone with 6 months to live? The vacation home in Vail, Dr. Pierce had mentioned it twice in passing, $1.2 million property, he'd said, and Brooke had cross-referenced the deed, found the purchase date 3 years ago, and calculated that a pediatric physician's salary didn't produce that equity without supplementary income streams. She drove home with the radio off, watching the traffic patterns, noticing the dark sedan that had been 3 cars back from the hospital exit. Pentagon surveillance was competent but obvious if you were trained to recognize it. She let it follow her home, took the same route, signaled her turns properly, obeyed all traffic laws. No one could accuse her of anything. No one could prove she was anything other than a struggling nurse being systematically destroyed by an ambitious doctor with something to hide. Her apartment was dark when she arrived. The flag she'd been holding since Tikrit, the folded triangle from Staff Sergeant Maria Okonkwo's funeral ceremony, the one she wasn't supposed to have, the one would raise questions her cover story couldn't answer, was still locked in her car. She'd moved it last week when the FBI had started asking questions about her background check. She'd moved it because some objects were too dangerous to keep in a place where investigators could find them, because some objects told stories that contradicted everything she'd claimed to be. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that at 0300 hours, just 12 hours away, the monitors in room 447 would alarm. Sergeant Cross would start dying from something that Dr. Pierce's incompetence had allowed to develop unchecked because the on-call resident was fresh out of residency and terrified of making mistakes. Cross's oxygen saturation would drop to critical levels. His trachea would deviate. His jugular veins would bulge like cables. And Brooke Sullivan, the quiet nurse who'd been systematically humiliated in front of patients and families, the one who'd been written up for insubordination, the one who'd been isolated by her colleagues through Dr. Pierce's calculated campaign, she would face a choice that would burn through 18 months of operational security in 30 seconds. She didn't know that yet. She didn't know that her hands would move with muscle memory from battlefield medicine instead of hospital protocol. She didn't know that one decision would end her mission, expose her identity, and ultimately destroy the man who'd been destroying her reputation piece by piece. Right now, she sat in her dark apartment with the television off and the world muted. Right now, she was just a nurse going home after a difficult shift, carrying nothing but her secrets and her scrubs and the kind of restraint that comes from knowing you're stronger than anyone surrounding you could possibly understand. She didn't turn on the lights. The darkness felt earned. The darkness felt safe. The darkness felt like the last moment before everything changed forever. The code alarm shrieked through the ICU at 0300 hours. A sound like nothing else in the hospital, primal, electronic, impossible to ignore. Brooke was in the supply closet when it hit, restocking full lines with the methodical precision of someone whose hands had learned to move in the dark. She didn't hesitate. Didn't look up. Just set down the last bag and moved toward the door at the exact moment her brain registered, room for 47. Sergeant Cross. Her boots made no sound on the tile. Muscle memory took over. The same movement pattern from Tikrit, from 1,000 drills, from muscle tissue that remembered what the conscious mind tried to forget. 30 meters. 15. 10. The hallway opened into the critical care unit like a throat swallowing her whole, and then she was through the doorway and the scene crystallized in front of her with the clarity of a combat situation, everything in perfect, terrible focus. Sergeant Dylan Cross was gasping. Not breathing. Gasping like a fish pulled from water, his mouth opening and closing in silent panic, his jaw working at air that wouldn't go down. His trachea was deviated hard right, pulled toward his right shoulder by a pressure differential she could see without any monitors, the kind of physics that killed people in minutes. His jugular veins bulged like electrical cables straining under current, his neck swollen, his face darkening from the exertion of pulling air through collapsed pathways. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed right lung. Pressure building in his chest cavity with nowhere to go. His oxygen saturation read 72 on the monitor and dropping, the numbers falling like a weight through water. The on-call resident, some third-year named Williams, maybe 28, sweat already beading on his forehead, stood frozen at the foot of the bed, hands gripping the rails, his eyes moving between Cross and the code cart as if the solution existed somewhere in the architecture of the room. "I need the chest tray," he was saying, but his voice had that quality of someone speaking from inside water, muffled and slow. "Where's the chest tray? Who has the chest tray?" A nurse at his elbow, Sarah from Nights, was already digging through drawers that suddenly all looked identical, all the same color, all equally wrong. Brooke crossed the room in 4 strides. Time had folded into that strange combat compression where seconds contained entire minutes. The crash cart was 2 steps away from her. The 14-gauge needle was in the crash tray, exactly where it always was, exactly where her hand knew it would be, where some part of her that had lived in desert heat and dust storm chaos remembered every single inventory from 100 midnight medical interventions. She didn't grab it tentatively. She palmed it the way she'd palmed a tourniquet in Tikrit, the way she'd held 4s in vehicle gunfire, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd done this exact motion 1,000 times before any of these people were born. "Second intercostal, midclavicular line," she said. Her voice was different now. Flat. Not a request. Not a question. The kind of voice that came from somewhere deeper than nerves, from a place where rank and training had rewired the vocal cords. She was already moving toward Cross's exposed right chest, already seeing the landmarks the way a musician sees sheet music, the angle of ribs, the precise millimeter where bone became space became pocket became pressure release. Dr. Williams turned, his mouth opening, to object, to pull rank, to do whatever it is residents do when their authority is being erased in real time. But Brooke didn't wait for language. She didn't ask permission. She didn't say, "Excuse me," or "If I may." She positioned herself at the patient's right side, palpated the intercostal space with 2 fingers, 1, 2, there, and pressed the needle through skin, through muscle, through fascia with the controlled force of someone whose hands had been trained by the United States military to do exactly this thing. The feeling was the same as it always was. Resistance. Then give. And then the hiss. That sound. That perfect, unmistakable, life-giving hiss of pressure escaping. Air rushing out like a held breath finally released, like a confession, like surrender. The sound that meant pressure was dropping, that the heart could expand again, that the lungs could inflate into the space that had been crushed by pneumatic force. Cross's chest heaved. His oxygen saturation on the monitor, 72, 78, 82, climbing like a ladder, 88, 91, 94, the numbers rising in real time, becoming a rhythm again, becoming evidence. 30 seconds from gas to stability. That was all it took. Brooke withdrew the needle. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers. Not shaking. Not trembling. Just moving through the sequence with the kind of clean precision that came from having already survived the worst thing that could happen. Behind her, the room had gone the way rooms do after crisis, that strange electric stillness where everyone is breathing but nobody wants to breathe, where the realization of what just happened is still installing itself in their brains like software catching up to reality. Sarah was staring. Williams was staring. The resident code officer who'd just arrived through the other door was staring. And on the monitor, the waveform was textbook normal sinus rhythm, the kind of rhythm that meant a human being was still alive because of what had just happened in this room, because someone had moved when everyone else had frozen, because hands had done what training had taught them to do when panic wanted to be the answer instead. Cross's eyelids fluttered. His oxygen saturation held at 95. His blood pressure began to climb back from the basement where it had been falling. The crisis was over. The patient would live. The crisis for Brooke was just beginning. Dr. Pierce arrived at 0304 hours. Brooke knew the time because she was watching the wall clock when she heard his footsteps, that particular cadence that meant he was walking fast, that he'd been called from somewhere else in the hospital, that he was coming with intention. His face when he entered the room was the color of something volcanic. She was standing at the bedside still, checking Cross's breath sounds with a stethoscope, confirming what the monitor was already telling her, and she saw Pierce take in the scene the way a prosecutor catalogues evidence. The needle still visible on the crash cart. The exposed chest with the equipment marks still visible on Cross's skin. The oxygen saturation at 95 and holding. The chest X-ray already pulled up on the tablet by the resident, the one showing re-expansion of the right lung, the pressure released, the crisis resolved. William starting to say, Dr. Pierce, she performed a needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, patient was at OSAT of 72 an. But Pierce was already looking at Brooke with an expression like watching someone complete a sentence he'd been writing since the beginning. Like she'd just given him exactly what he needed. Like she'd walked into the trap he'd been setting without even knowing the trap existed. Nurse Sullivan performed an unauthorized invasive procedure, Pierce said. His voice was very quiet. Very certain. The kind of quiet that meant he'd already moved past the surprise of the moment and was already calculating the institutional leverage. Without physician authorization. Without protocol clearance. This constitutes practicing medicine without a license under Colorado State Statute 12-36-106. William's face changed. The realization moving across his features like a cloud passing over sun. But she saved his life. She violated protocol, Pierce said flatly. That's what matters now. Brooke didn't flinch. Didn't lower the stethoscope. Didn't do anything except finish listening to Cross's bilateral breath sounds, confirm the symmetry of the re-expansion, acknowledge the success of the procedure with the same clinical attention she'd given to performing it. When she finally spoke, her voice was different from the one she'd used 3 minutes earlier. Calmer. Emptier. The voice of someone who understood that she'd just burned the mission to save the patient and had made peace with that trade before she'd even picked up the needle. He was in arrest, she said. Trachea deviated. Jugular distension. Pressure index was critical. I performed a life-saving emergency procedure. I'd do it again. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Pierce moved toward the door, his phone already in his hand, already calling, his voice moving down the hallway, reaching toward administration, reaching toward legal, reaching toward the mechanisms that would turn this moment of heroism into evidence of incompetence. The next words Brooke heard were coming from security. And they were telling her to collect her belongings and come with them right now. Security's hand on her elbow was professional, impersonal, the grip of someone following protocol rather than conveying contempt. Brooke moved through the corridors she'd walked for 18 months with the same measured pace she'd used in Tikrit, boots on tile, one step after another, no indication that the world was collapsing into rubble behind her eyes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Her scrub still smelled like antiseptic and Sergeant Cross's blood. The written warning in Dr. Pierce's precise handwriting had been taped to her locker at 03 for 5 hours. By 0600, the emergency incident report was filed. By 0645, he'd invoked Joint Commission Protocol 2847-B, citing unauthorized invasive procedure by unlicensed personnel, demanding her immediate termination and nursing license suspension. The words had precision, legal weight, the kind of language that sounded like justice until he realized it was a weapon. Hospital administration had placed her on investigative leave pending full credentials review at 0715 hours. The director's voice had been apologetic but final. "Captain," he'd caught himself. "Ms. Sullivan, we have to follow procedure. It's not personal. It never was. That's what made it work." She'd changed out of her scrubs in the locker room while another nurse pretended not to watch. The tag on her uniform read Sullivan, same as it had for 18 months, same as the tattoo on Sergeant Cross's forearm that he'd gotten the day she dragged him through the streets of Tikrit with a sucking chest wound. She'd changed into jeans and a grey hoodie that smelled like home, like a different life, like the person she'd been before she'd become someone else entirely. The drive to her apartment in Old North End took 17 minutes. The dawn was the color of wet concrete, the sky pressing down like a surgical drape. Her hand stayed steady on the wheel, muscle memory, or maybe just the absence of choice. Crying was a luxury she'd learned to schedule. She didn't schedule this. At 0900 hours, she pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for 31 minutes without moving. The Honda Civic was parked at an angle, like she'd forgotten how to be careful about small things. The garage door was closed. The house was dark except for the porch light that had burned all night because Maya was afraid of the dark and Brooke was never home to turn it off anyway. She finally reached for the glove compartment. Her fingers trembled, not fear, not weakness. Restraint. The trembling was restraint, the physical manifestation of 18 months of controlled breathing finally hitting the wall of what she'd done. She pulled out the folded flag. It was small in her hands, impossibly small for the weight it carried. Staff Sergeant Maria Okonkwo's flag. 14 stars on one half, 13 on the other, folded into a tight triangle the way they'd taught her at Fort Bragg, the way she'd held it when they lowered Maria into the ground at Ullington, the way she'd kept it locked away because bringing it into Cedar Creek Medical would raise questions her cover couldn't answer. She carried it inside at 0902 hours and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the lights. The house was cold. The house was always cold when she was the only one in it during daylight. She placed the flag on the table in front of her, centered it like an altar, and let the tears come. Silent. Relentless. The kind of crying that doesn't make noise because it's been held too long, compressed too tight, transformed into something that moved through her body like a wound opening. 18 months. 3 weeks from completing the evidence chain on Pierce's fraud. The inflated equipment charges, the phantom procedures coded on terminal patients, the insurance fraud funding a vacation home in Vail while kids in Colorado Springs shared dialysis machines. She'd been that close. She documented the patterns in encrypted files on a phone that looked like a burner but connected to a Pentagon line she could activate with a thumbprint. She'd built the case layer by layer, interview by interview, while walking the hospital corridors in scrubs with her name on them, while accepting written warnings and break room silence and Dr. Pierce's voice cutting through the monitors like shrapnel. And then Sergeant Cross's oxygen saturation had dropped to 72. The decision wasn't a decision. It was the thing you did before you decided anything. Her hands had moved at 0312 hours, muscle memory meeting present tense, the 14-gauge needle finding the second intercostal space with the precision of something that had trained in Tikrit, had trained in 100 scenarios where the only choice was the next breath. 30 seconds. That's all it took to commit treason against her own mission. She'd saved one man's life and destroyed 18 months of operational placement. The flag stayed on the table. Her scrubs lay on the kitchen chair where she'd dropped them, still damp with the humidity of the hospital, still carrying the smell of fluorescent-lit corridors and beeping monitors and the particular stench of fear that nobody talked about, that sharp, metallic scent that fills a room when someone is dying and the people around them are running out of time. At 1030 hours, she heard small footsteps on the stairs. Princess pajamas first, pink, sequined, the kind of thing that had nothing to do with the life Brooke lived. Then Maya, 7 years old, dark hair messed up from sleep, rubbing her eyes with the back of her fist. The girl stopped at the threshold of the kitchen, confused by the shape of her mother sitting in darkness at 0930 in the morning on a Thursday. "Mommy, why are you home?" Brooke's throat closed. She tried to wipe her face, but her hands were still shaking, not fear, not weakness. Restraint finally breaking. She couldn't stop it. "Did you get fired?" Maya's voice was small, frightened by something she didn't understand. Children knew. They always knew when the adult world had torn open. Brooke reached for her daughter and pulled her onto her lap, this girl who'd been waiting for her to come home for 7 years, who'd grown up in a house where mommy worked nights and disappeared into bathrooms to cry where the shower could drown out the sound. The folded flag was between them on the table. Maya looked at it, not understanding what it meant, understanding everything about what it meant. "I made a choice," Brooke whispered, and her voice sounded like someone else's, raw, fractured, nothing like the steady tone she'd cultivated for 18 months. "I chose someone. And it cost me." Maya didn't answer because she was 7 and her mother was crying and that was the only language that mattered. She just pressed her face against Brooke's chest and waited for the storm to pass, the way children do, the way Brooke had waited for her own mother decades ago, before the academy, before Tikrit, before she'd learned that sometimes choosing to save one person meant losing everything else. The tears kept coming. Silent. 18 months of composure finally hitting the floor. At 1000 hours the next morning, approximately 22 hours after Dr. Pierce had filed his emergency incident report, after hospital administration had placed her on investigative leave, after she'd sat in that kitchen for 9 hours straight holding a flag and a daughter and the wreckage of an operational placement, the hospital CEO called an emergency assembly in the main atrium of Cedar Creek Medical. 200 staff members crowded the marble floor, confusion rippling through the departments like water disturbed by something moving underneath. The director of nursing was there. The trauma surgeons. The night shift staff who should have been sleeping. The respiratory therapists. The custodians. Everyone. Dr. Pierce stood near the podium with barely concealed satisfaction, his face arranged in the expression of a man vindicated, a man about to watch his nemesis publicly dismantled. He didn't know yet. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, that low electrical drone that nobody noticed until silence demanded attention. The atrium doors opened. The atrium doors opened, and CEO Richard Harmon's voice cut across 200 staff members gathered on the marble floor like a courtroom. His tone carried the weight of institutional gravity, the kind that precedes either promotions or executions. Dr. Pierce stood near the podium in his pressed white coat, jaw tight with barely concealed satisfaction, certain that what was about to unfold would be the final nail in Brooke Sullivan's career. He'd already drafted the hospital's statement. He'd already called his country club friends. He'd already started imagining her name scrubbed from the staff directory. But that wasn't what happened next. The HR director, Patricia Mullins, stepped forward with a manila folder. Her face was pale. Her hands trembled, actually trembled, as she approached the microphone. "During our standard background verification process for the investigative leave," she said, and her voice cracked slightly, "the system flagged a Level 6 classified security clearance registered to Brooke Sullivan." The folder hit the podium with the weight of a detonation. Level 6 clearance triggers automatic Pentagon notification. That notification arrived this morning at 08 for 7 hours. The silence didn't just arrive. It descended. It pressed down like a physical weight. Fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone above the crowd. Dr. Pierce's face shifted from satisfaction to confusion to something that looked almost like panic. "I don't understand," he said, voice climbing. "She's a pediatric nurse. A civilian employee. There must be a mistake." The doors to the atrium opened again. This time, military boots echoed on tile. Sergeant Dylan Cross rolled in his wheelchair, oxygen cannula in place, his chest rising and falling with effort, but his eyes were suddenly clear. Devastatingly clear. The morphine fog had lifted. The recognition hit him like a physical thing. When he saw her standing motionless near the back of the crowd, his mouth opened. "Viper 6, he whispered, and the name hung in the air like the call of the dead returning. His eyes filled with water. Recognition. Understanding. "Captain." A Marine colonel in dress blue stepped to the podium, medals catching the overhead lights like a constellation of gold and silver. His bearing alone commanded silence, the kind of silence that comes from understanding you're standing in the presence of something incomprehensibly larger than yourself. He opened a leather folder and began reading, his voice steady as a metronome. "Silver Star. Awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity while under heavy fire in Tikrit, Iraq. Captain Brooke Sullivan carried 3 wounded personnel to safety while sustaining 2 gunshot wounds, rendering life-saving medical aid to each soldier under continuous hostile fire." He paused. The next part came slower. One of those soldiers was Sergeant Dylan Cross, whose life she preserved with tactical field medicine before transport. The citation notes Captain Sullivan returned to hostile fire twice after sustaining injuries to ensure no personnel remained behind. Dr. Pierce took a step back from the podium. Someone in the crowd, a resident, made a sound like a breath being released from a pressure valve. "That's not," Pierce started, his voice smaller now, "that's not operative information I was given. Hospital administration didn't." "Shut your mouth," a 2-star general said from the atrium doors, and the words fell like a gavel. His uniform bore the insignia of CENTCOM, Peterson Air Force Base, stitched into his personnel record with the kind of authority that made CEOs and medical boards irrelevant. He walked toward the podium with the deliberate pace of someone who didn't need to hurry because the entire room had already moved aside. His eyes found Brooks across the atrium. He saluted her. Not casually. A full military salute, fist across chest, held for 3 seconds. When he lowered his hand, his voice cut through the atrium like a blade. Captain Sullivan was conducting a sanctioned investigation into Medicare fraud at this facility. The investigation was classified. She could not reveal her operational status without compromising the mission. That investigation is now complete. Dr. Pierce's attorney stood up from the back row, briefcase already in hand, already calculating escape angles. But the general wasn't finished. Federal auditors completed their preliminary audit this morning, the general continued, and now an FBI agent stepped forward, Special Agent Mora, her credentials already visible. Over 3 years, Dr. Pierce authorized $2.3 million in fraudulent Medicare billings. Phantom CT scans coded on patients too critically ill to transport. Equipment charges for devices never opened. Pharmaceutical claims on terminal patients who received no medication. The money purchased a vacation property in Vail and funded personal accounts routed through 3 shell corporations. Mora placed documents on the podium. 8 folders. Thick. The kind of documentation that doesn't lie. The medical board has convened an emergency session. Dr. Pierce's license is being stripped. The Department of Justice has filed 17 felony counts, Medicare fraud, conspiracy, filing false claims, insurance fraud. Bail was set at $200,000 this morning. His attorney is aware of the terms. Dr. Pierce's face had gone the color of clinical death. His hands gripped the podium edge like he was holding onto the edge of a cliff. Around the atrium, staff members whispered, not angry whispers, but the sound of collective understanding. The quiet person they dismissed. The nurse they'd isolated. The woman they'd called inadequate had been walking among them as a federal investigator, and they'd been too distracted by her composure to notice she was actually a soldier. "Captain Sullivan," the general said, turning to face her directly, "your mission parameters are satisfied. You're authorized to return to civilian status immediately. Your discharge papers are being processed. Full honors. Your back pay will be deposited within 90 days. Brooke stood motionless for a moment. The room waited. 200 people holding their breath, waiting to see what a captain does when she's told she's free. She stepped forward. Not toward the podium. Toward Sergeant Cross in his wheelchair. She took his hand, the one still trembling slightly from treatments, from weakness, from almost dying, and her grip was steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was different now. The deferential tone was gone. What emerged was something harder. Something forged. "You're going to finish remission and come back to Cedar Creek Medical as a contracted physical therapy consultant. You're going to help other soldiers heal. And you're going to remember that you don't owe me anything, I owed you." Cross squeezed her hand. His eyes glistened. Brooke turned to the general. "With respect, sir, I'm not leaving." Her voice carried the kind of command that doesn't ask permission. "I'm requesting civilian conversion to Cedar Creek Medical's permanent staff. Effective immediately. There's work here that needs doing." The general's expression shifted, not surprise, but something like recognition. Like understanding why the Pentagon had selected her in the first place. "Noted, Captain. Your conversion is approved." He paused. "You'll report to your new nursing director tomorrow at 0700. What happened next, what the hospital would talk about for years, was that no one moved immediately. The crowd stood in that atrium like they were processing something they couldn't quite name. The quietest person in the room had just dismantled a criminal, saved a soldier, and made her choice. Not to return to glory, but to stay. Dr. Pierce, his attorney pulling at his elbow, walked toward the exit with the gait of someone moving through deep water. By that afternoon, he'd been escorted from the building by security. By evening, the hospital had announced his termination for cause. By the following week, his medical license had been officially revoked. The fastest revocation in Colorado history. 6 months later, someone spotted him at Pikes Peak Community College's continuing education building, teaching CPR basics to a room of bored teenagers for $18 an hour. His Rolex was gone. His shoes came from Target clearance. His face had aged a decade. Back at Cedar Creek Medical, in room for 47, Brooke Sullivan adjusted the 4-line on Sergeant Dylan Cross, who was no longer dying, who was in remission now, whose experimental treatment had been funded partly from the recovered fraudulent billings that the federal court ordered returned. Morning sun streamed through the windows overlooking Colorado Springs, the mountains sharp and blue beyond the glass. She'd chosen to stay. To wear scrubs by choice rather than necessity. To let people see her competence, her steady hands, her unflinching calm that came from having survived impossible things. Cross squeezed her hand. "You could have left," he said quietly. "I did," she replied. "Now I'm choosing to come back." On the windowsill behind them, the folded flag from Staff Sergeant Maria Okonkwo caught the light. No longer hidden. Finally seen. If you've made it this far, you understand, true heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the person standing quietly beside you, holding your hand, refusing to let you die alone. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because these stories deserve to be heard. Like this video, and comment below. If you had to choose between your mission and one human life, what would you do? I'm publishing a new story every week. Don't miss it.